We're going to talk about Shakespeare and Company today. Now, let me just have a disclaimer here. This is Shakespeare and Company by Sylvia Beach. If you don't get things copyrighted and you're not Apple and you don't have a team of lawyers, you can have something, many things named Shakespeare and Company, including other books. And a long time ago, I was in we discussed a book called All the King's Men. I may have told you about this, about Huey Long. And one of the members showed up having read All the President's Men, because things happen, right? So I apologize to anyone who read the other title, but I'm sure it was Bashert meant to be, and you will have something interesting to add to the discussion in some way. So I welcome you all here, and I'm just going to go ahead and recap a little bit about the book, and then we'll go on to we'll dig right in. So I think the best way to do this is I am first going to talk a little bit about Sylvia's background, so we can all learn about her, because she talks a little bit about her background in Shakespeare and Company. But if all things happen today as they should, which means I don't go on forever, I would like to talk about her background and then the timeline of the store, Shakespeare and Company, the bookshop or the lending library. And then I want to talk about the war years, because this is kind of where Shakespeare and Company's story ends. But Sylvia's story gets very interesting, because I want to talk specifics about her imprisonment during the war, the closing of the shop, an amazing unknown hero called Tudor Wilkinson, and Sylvia's relationship with helping students during the war and also hiding Jewish people during the war. We'll also talk about her legacy, the store's legacy, some of her just fun personal traits. And if you want to know more about Adrienne, I will be happy to talk about her. If you want to dig into Joyce and you want to dig into Ulysses, I'm more than happy to go there as well. But first, a wee bit of context so we know what time period we are in. And that is the time period of the lost generation. So this is the generation that is where we have people coming to adulthood during World War I and feeling those effects after. These are people who were born between 1883 and 1900, and it's come to be used as referred to a group of people who were the expats, the expatriate American writers who lived in Paris during the 1920s. Think Midnight in Paris by the film by Woody Allen. Don't think about Woody Allen. Just think about the film Midnight in Paris, okay? The term was coined by Ernest Hemingway, who used it in an epigraph in his 1926 novel, The Sun Also Rises, quote, "You are all a lost generation." And then lost in this context, referring to the wandering, the searching, the directionless group after the war. In our book, we meet artists and authors who are part of the avant-garde or part of the literary modernist movement. So I needed to know more about that. So just a bit of defining as we move further. The avant-garde, the very new, are novelist, writers, architects, whose creative perspectives and experimental works challenge the contemporary bourgeois society. So if you think about like Le Corbusier, I'm sure I pronounced that wrong, or Ulysses, E.E. Cummings, Ezra Pound, there we are. Literary modernism, this is a term that originates in the late 19th and 20th century. Again, This is a break with everything traditional that we know about prose and poetry. Ezra Pond kind of encompassed this with his maxim in his poem that I did not read because I couldn't quite understand it, but the maxim was, make it new. Okay. Why was this all happening in Paris and not, let's say, in Omaha? But perhaps, there is a connection to Omaha. I'm sure there was. Anyway, actually, I can make a connection to Omaha in this book. But anyway, it happened in a city like Paris, some other places too, but mostly Paris, because location. This is a geographical center between the UK and Southern Europe. And then if we think Eastern Europe, and if we want to stretch the West all the way to the United States, this is kind of a nexus. Paris was cheap for young creatives. Why was it cheap? Because after the war, everyone was ravaged and broke. So you could afford to live in Paris where you really couldn't afford to do the same thing in, let's say, New York City. All right, so there's a little bit of cultural context for you. Now on to Sylvia Beach and her bio. Her name. She actually was born Nancy Woodbridge Beach in Baltimore. She was named after her grandmother, and at some point, I'm not sure, maybe someone here knows and can let me know, she does change her name to Sylvia. Her father was a minister, and her family's involvement with the church goes back to her grandparents, who are missionaries in India. She was the middle sister, and we get to see both her sisters make cameo appearances in the book. Mary Hollingsworth Morris, we knew her as Holly in the book, and Eleanor Elliot, who would adopt the stage name of Cyprian, is also in the book. In 1901, she moves to France because her father is appointed assistant minister of the American Church in Paris. And then in 1906, she goes back to New Jersey. This is all moving because dad gets dad is transferred. She's a book lover at an early age, but she has very little formal schooling because they're always traveling here and there. In 1917, now the book opens in 19, so think of 19 as our kind of like the fulcrum. In 17, she moves from New Jersey, then to Spain, and then to Paris. All this moving around, she picks up Spanish, she picks up Latin, she works for the Red Cross, and then she eventually lands in the Sorbonne in 1917 and begins studying French literature. I'm going to take a time out here with a disclaimer about my research and sourcing for the book. The sources for this book to me were on much shakier ground as far as unbiased research than probably any other research I have done. And I don't know if it's because this is not a well-known literary figure, or she's only recently been studied, and perhaps research today takes on more of a certain point of view in order to prove your point. But I'm just going to leave it at that. It kind of stood on shakier legs than usually for me when I report to you. All right. So while studying at the Bibliothèque Nationale, and I expect people like Diana and anyone else here who is fluent in French to please always correct me, she read Adrienne Moyer's, she read about her lending library and bookshop called La Maison des Amis de Livre on the Rue de l'Odéon in Paris. And she decided to go check it out. And she recounts in the book how she fell in love with this bookstore. She said that the bookstore gave her this feeling of peacefulness. And she decided that she wanted to do the same thing, but she couldn't afford to. What do I mean by the same thing? She wanted to bring French literature to New York City and New York and showcase French authors, because Adrienne was doing that with American authors. She was translating their works and presenting them in the bookshop, but she also had a great wealth of French literature too. But she couldn't afford to do it in New York. So she thought when she befriended Adrienne, and we can talk about their relationship, she decided she could do it in Paris, but she only had $3,000 capital. So she wrote to her mother and said, basically, please send cash, which her mother did. She sent her enough money, and Adrienne walked her through the complicated bureaucracy of renting, and she opens a bookstore. So 1919, we opened Shakespeare and Company. Not long after she opens the shop, Adrienne's former lover and business partner named Suzanne Bonnier dies unexpectedly, and Sylvia and Adrienne move in together. Within months of, or within the year, Shakespeare and Company, this bookstore and lending library. Why do I say lending library? Books were expensive. So you didn't necessarily have to buy books. You could pay a smaller fee and you could rent the book. So the lending library is growing so much that she ends up relocating on the same street as Adrienne. So these stores are on this one street, Lodian. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, but anyway, it was a real mecca. There were little coffee shops, there were music shops, there was a theater down the street. It was a wonderful, we would all want to live near it. Okay, this would be a place we would want to live, right? The store attracted both French and American readers. And then Sylvia and Adrienne, eventually these two women find themselves at the center of avant-garde literature. And I would say their center, their nexus was happening because of the bookstores. And then we have over on, I believe it was Rue de Fleur, we have who? Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Tolkis having the salon in Gertrude's home. Four powerful women, really being, if I had to tweet about it, being the house mothers, the agents, the advocates, the life coaches for what we would say today are classic books that we, classic authors who have really, risen into the pantheon of American literature. So anyway, not only were books in the bookshop, but there was also modern art. And as we read on in the book, we find out that our very own Sherwood Anderson from Winesburg, Ohio fame is so thrilled when he shows up at the bookshop and he sees a copy of Winesburg, Ohio in the window. I mean, can you imagine, for those of you who are writers, what an honor that would be? Isn't there some song by Barry Manilow, Looks Like We Made It? If he were alive, then it would probably be going through his head. And such a fun anecdote, I can't think, anecdote, I don't know, story in the book where Sylvia comments that Mrs. Anderson breaches the protocol when at Gertrude Stein's salon because Mrs. Anderson wants to stay and talk with the men, where everyone else knows that she's supposed to go in the kitchen and speak with Alice B. Tolkis' group, right, and wash dishes, etc., while Gertrude has a serious conversation with Sherwood, etc. I thought that was so funny. And I'm so glad we read Gertrude Stein's book, autobiography of Alice B. Tolkis, because it gave us context to come to this book. All right. Now, the women who ran these two bookstores shared this ethos of cross-cultural exchange. They would be, today Malcolm Gladwell would have called them both connectors and mavens of their crafts. The New York Times did a story on the bookstore and described Sylvia Beach as follows: a slight young woman in mannish attire with bobbed hair, keen, level eyes, lips both firm and sensitive, who was ready to welcome visitors almost any morning or afternoon. But he goes on to say, there's just one thing that has been banned indefinitely from her list of activities. Don't ask her to publish your latest novel or the history of your life or any other masterpiece. Don't furthermore try to tempt her with the information that such a work of yours is erotic and certain to shock the sensibilities of the Vice Commission. She would like it known that she is not a publisher. And of course, this happens because of her relationship with Joyce. All right, so it's important to know that Shakespeare and Company was never lucrative. And if I had to point the blame, it would be at Joyce. But anyway, I'm not a scholar, so I can't do that. But Diana's shaking her head, so I'm going with I'm right. Anyway, by 1936, the store is truly struggling. And Andre Gide organizes a group of writers called the Friends of Shakespeare and Company. Everyone pays 200 francs a year to attend the meetings, and it attracts a who's who. It's at capacity, and she's really feeling now like this place is moving. Quote, we're so glorious with all these famous writers and the press we receive that we actually do begin to do very well in business. So things are rolling along, but we all know what's coming next, although she doesn't. In 1937, Sylvia is awarded the Knight of Legion of Honor. And she wears this ribbon from the country of France. She wears it everywhere. She's so proud of it, and she wears it throughout the war. So by 1940, many of her international clients had left Paris. Nevertheless, she tries at first to keep the store open during the occupation. She struggles to find fuel to keep the store heated, but she organizes book readings and poetry readings. And she also she organizes disc soirees for her customers. She's playing the record player. And these are recordings of literary books. So maybe, I know that Vita Sackville-West did recordings of her works. So who knows, maybe Vita's works were played at Sylvia's shop. She was also, during the war, financially, morally, supporting students from the Sorbonne who had came over either from the UK or the US and were basically stranded. She describes her encounters with the Nazis in the book. I'm just going to pull a few quotes. Quote, the Gestapo would come and they'd say, quote, you have a Jewish girl you had in the bookshop and you have a black mark against you. And I'd say, okay. And they said, we'll come for you, And I always said to them, and I always said, okay, to them. And then one day they came. All right. So I want to talk about a young girl named Françoise Burnham, who was a 17-year-old student and a bookshop assistant who happened to be Jewish. Her employment of Françoise is the reason why she was in prison. It wasn't why she was being sassy to a Gestapo guy, all right? It was her nationality as an American and her friendship with Françoise and other Jews that marked her as an enemy alien of the Nazi regime. And in the book, it talks about how there is a Nazi who comes in and wants to buy a copy of Finnegan's Wake, and she has the audacity to say no, which, we have historical context. We realize what a brave act it was then, right, for her to do that. So now I give full disclosure again by saying my sources I don't feel are the strongest, especially when it comes to dates, let alone me screwing up dates. So I'm going to be very I'm going to give all the specifics and you can figure out where you want to go. I believe it was in 1942. It was either in August or September that Sylvia Beach is taken in the first roundup of American women in Paris. There's about 300. She talks about this. They are interned at the zoo where they're treated fairly well. And she also finds humor reporting in the book. They were kept in the monkey house, and friends who wanted to visit simply paid admission and they could chat across hedges. A month later, she is moved to another camp in Vitel, and I may not have the pronunciation right, France, where she stays for approximately 6 months with other American and English women until approximately the spring of 43. You know, we don't hear a lot about female women being imprisoned during the war, American women, so this to me was fascinating. She is desperate at this camp. And she pleads with friends to find a release. And there is an influential friend who does bargain with the Vichy regime for her release. And in either 1942 or by 1943, it is a man named, an American from St. Louis named Tudor Wilkinson, who manages to secure her release in February. Well, I heard the name Tudor Wilkinson, and I thought, I need to know more about Tudor Wilkinson, because she just does a passing reference to him in the book. So I did a dive on Tudor, and here's what I discovered. Tudor was probably what I would refer to as a spoiled rich kid from St. Louis, who kind of got in trouble with the law, but had a good heart. He probably was Saul Goodman before Saul Goodman went dark. He was an American art collector and amateur art dealer. It was said he gave Hermann Göring a painting in exchange for his wife's freedom from an internment camp. And he also stored weapons and radio equipment for the French resistance during the Second World War. So again, his name is Tudor Wilkinson. And there will be millions of names and stories that we will never know about the Second World War. So anytime I have the opportunity to discuss these individuals that aren't on the radar, I am pleased to share them with you. It gives me such great joy. So I think that Tudor Wilkinson deserves his own books. It deserves his own biographies and films, etc. If anything, his name is so interesting. So it is he, Tudor, who manages the release of Sylvia Beach, because he was a subscriber to her bookshop, her lending library. And he also had a friend who he knew was a subscriber to the library. This friend was Jacques Benoit Michon, who was a member of the library and also was now in the Vichy government. And he pleaded the case to him, and that's how she got released. So it's all about who you know. So that's how Sylvia becomes released. And it says she just returned to Paris and moved in again with Adrienne, but she didn't. She hid. She hid further when she went back to town. And she was able to hide again because of the generosity in the individual of other American women who I'm going to tell you about, because again, who knew, right? And those women, let's see, let me find two. There was an American woman who married very well because she became the Countess Clara de Chambron. She was a Shakespearean scholar, and she was instrumental in helping Americans during the war. And the American philanthropist, Grace Whitney. Grace Whitney, stay with me, funded the refurbishment and the reconstruction of a residence hall at the Sorbonne called the Foyer the Foyer International des Étudiants. So it was a residence for women students, which she gifted to the University of Paris, sorry, not the Sorbonne, when she passed away. This is where Sylvia hid after she got released. She went and hid with the students. Now, why would she go hide with the students? Well, books bring people together, don't they? Students loved Sylvia Beach's bookshop, and Sylvia advertised in all the student journals, come buy your books or become a subscribing member and, rent your books from my bookstore. So she employed students. It was a place to come study. And Sylvia, like a mother hen, she just attracted people. She said that she saw herself as having a pedagogical mission when it came to students. She said, it is that I am by no means an academic. And during the years of my existence of my library, that's what she called the bookstore, I have educated my own self by instructing students. I am, in short, my most faithful bunny. Now, bunny was a play on words on the word subscriber, which in French is abonné. So this is me trying to tie in the students, the word abonné, and all of how Sylvia was just connected to so many different circles. So I explained that Sylvia hid. And I also want to tell you now about a found diary, which is how I came across this information about Françoise Benin, the 17-year-old assistant, and about Sylvia's impact on these female students who basically were stuck in Paris during the war. There was, at the University of Sheffield, some academic, God bless her, did her thesis on Madeleine Blaze, Blaess, her diaries that were of her time at the Sorbonne. She was a British student living in Paris who got stuck there, right? And Madeleine reports on what happens to Françoise and what happens to Sylvia during the war. So it's her accounts to her in her journals, and also letters she writes back and forth to her parents, where we can fill in the blanks of what happened during the war to Sylvia, and how Sylvia was so helpful. She was giving students money to these students to stay alive, to feed themselves. She was finding beds for them. She was finding houses for them to live. She was just doing all the things every one of us would have done. But who knew? Because she doesn't brag about it in the book at all. So, hiding. Helping Jews during the war has been noted by biographers, although the evidence that we have compared to other accounts of hiding is not as strong. But I'm just going with it because guess what? I'm not an academic, so I don't have to answer to anyone's, any type of academic board or anything. So it is said that she had, there was a doctoral student named Leon Edel, who she befriended. And it is said that she also hid Bernheim, the Françoise, in her apartment, along with her books at the bookshop. And it because she had so much, she had space in that apartment. It is said that she hid more than just a few Jews as they were hiding and going from place, because it was a network. You didn't necessarily, everyone thinks Anne Frank, you're in one place. People traveled, just like the Underground Railroad. So she provided food, clothes, and lodging, and also for the author Arthur Kessler or Kostler, I have not read him, and also Jewish resistance workers. She was fighting the good fight. In order to see, when she would communicate with Adrienne in letters. So I guess Adrienne would go to the country to stay with her parents, and they would check on the mites. All the letters contain, please check on the mites. How are the mites doing? And that was code for the Jews that they were hiding, because they thought if anyone ever caught them or asked them about the letters, books can get moths and mites and things. And so that was the explanation that they would have given to the Gestapo if they said, what do you mean by mites? So their letters refer to these mites. Okay, it is also said that she helped the French resistance, and sheltered Allied airmen who were shot down in France. And then we all know, because she talks about in the book, in 1994, Hemingway symbolically liberates the bookshop in person, but it never opens for business again because, frankly, she's exhausted, right? She's exhausted. Fast forward to 1951, an American named George Whitman opens a new bookshop in a different location in Paris and originally calls it La Minstrel, but renames it in 1964 Shakespeare and Country in honor of the late Sylvia Beach. And if you think he was just doing that because he was a brilliant marketer, today the store is run by his daughter. He has since passed, and her name is Sylvia Beach Whitman. So he was truly dedicated to Sylvia Beach, not only in this bookstore, but Whitman himself, during the 60s, supported beat poets in the same manner that Sylvia supported poets of the lost generation. In 1954, her partner, lover, and friend, Adrienne, was diagnosed with Meniere's disease. This affects the ears, causes tinnitus, hearing loss, migraines, etc. It is said back then the treatment may have done more harm than good, and unfortunately, she takes her life the following year. She says a year and a half later, writing to her sister, quote, I have a queer feeling about Adrienne that not only is she gone, but I've gone away myself somewhere, and I don't know where. And she's very casual. She writes don't know as DUNNO. But have no fear, she does have relationships afterwards, so she doesn't roam the earth sad. So how does she support herself for the rest of her life? Well, she has support from friends, gifts of small sums from articles and interviews. She wrote the autobiography that we read, and she did translations for magazines. But then there is such an interest in James Joyce's Ulysses and James Joyce and his writing that students from all over are knocking on her door wanting to know everything about James Joyce. They're studying him. They want to interview. So she enjoys this renaissance of being the wise woman on the mountain, having all these people come to her. Her honors include an honorary PhD and also a tribute at the U.S. Embassy in Paris. She lives in Paris until 1962. In that year, she passes away. So our book, Shakespeare and Company, goes into great detail about her life running this bookstore, giving us a fly on the wall idea of what it was like to run a bookshop that influenced, nurtured, directed, and helped navigate and govern the works of Fitzgerald, Hemingway, Joyce, and so many others, Sherwood Anderson, so many other writers. So I'm going to close out this session of me talking forever, and thank you so much for listening, and let you know that I have about, 3 years more work of things to talk about with Sylvia Beach that I mentioned, but we'll go ahead and close this portion. And I'd like to open it up to the group and ask you, what did you think of the book? Go ahead and unmute, and we'll go ahead and have our discussion. It's so good to see those who are joining us and those who are listening in. Welcome, welcome, welcome.
Well, I was excited because she actually mentioned John Dos Passos, who I
She did. She did. And I thought about you. So Phyllis, just go ahead and give your pitch for Don Dos
John
Passos.
Dos Passos was one of the Lost Generation, and I think the trilogy was called America. And the one that I remember reading as a teenager was called 1919. And it was a revelation to me.
Well, I tried to read that because you brought it to the group, and I found it so sophisticated that I didn't know if I could get through it. And I just thought, well, of course it's sophisticated because it's Phyllis.
Who read it at about 15.
Right.
So I didn't realize it was sophisticated, I'm sure.
Right. So so far it has not been on it has not reached the ballots, but maybe it will at some point. But that's great that you got that little kick out.
Yes, I was amused by that. And I don't know how I ever fell onto it. I have no recollection at all. But I mean, a lot of books floated around my house. So
right. Well, pretty cool. What did you think of the book, Phyllis, besides your run-in with John?
It reminded me in the New York Post, there's a page called Page 6.
I love it.
They're always name dropping, you know. That's probably where their picture of Ivana and E. Jean Carroll came from.
All right, Diana, what did you think of the book?
Well, you focus on the later part of her life. I thought her life and the life of the bookstore focused almost entirely on the 20s,
yes.
Which is when she meets Joyce and links up with him and becomes sort of his, I don't know, his mama. Certainly his admirer and forever his financial support, to the point where she bankrupts herself trying to publish this book that is considered obscene and forbidden both in America and in England and in Ireland, where he can't have it printed. And so she takes on this almost unbelievable chore and task of publishing this book that people still wonder about. I found fascinating interviews. By the way, the 1962 interview with Sylvia Beach, is an absolute gem. Everybody should watch it. And I found it because she at one point wants Joyce to read parts of Ulysses, and he does. And it's his voice is very strange, and of course he had this huge trouble later seeing, so they had to create very large print excerpts from Ulysses for him to read. But anyone who goes into that area of YouTube will find her interview of 1962, and she gives a great short summary of the book so that you almost feel you don't have to read it. But the book is fascinating because it's an overview of the cultural life of both America and Europe of the 20s, and especially the 20s. And there are these brief little sketches of people she meets, like H.D. Holder Doolittle, and people you've always wondered about, or if I'm into literary history, so all these names mean something to me, not that I know all of their works, like André Gide or Valérie Labeau or all of these people who play huge parts in the cultural life of the 20s. But she supports Hemingway as soon as he comes and takes some books out, and forever she is close to Joyce, who must have been a very difficult person, but everybody seemed so charmed by him. She says they would go out to eat, he and his wife and the two children, they would go out every evening to an expensive restaurant by taxi. He would eat very little and would drink very little, but he would tell everybody, have the most expensive pieces on the menu and I will pay for it. And then finally, when America opens up to print his book, he abandons her. And she doesn't say that at all. She's never complains about it. She's the most generous, big-hearted person that there is in publishing, which is a cutthroat business. Let's face it. And I don't want to dominate.
Oh, you're not dominating, and I love what you have to say. And if you'd like, I can do a dive into Joyce and Ulysses. I just wanted to, I think the first question, Diana, have you read Ulysses? Has everyone or anyone read?
Oh my God, how many times have I tried?
Me too. I'm like, I can't get past him having a shave in the morning, and I want to take the razor to myself. I'm like, I don't, what the hell is going on?
Oh, and it goes on endless. So I finally went into this British literary historians website and listened to him for about an hour, explaining all the 12 different stages. Right. Of course, it follows Ulysses, the Greek hero, and so on. But there's too much. There's too much in it.
Right. One must be so incredibly sophisticated, not only to read this book, but to then fall in love with it the way that Sylvia Beach did. Was it the time? Was it the place? Was it something about, I don't know, but you follow, it's, let me just explain. It's a day in the life of, hold on, let me get to it's Leopold a day in the life of, what's his first name? Bloom. Leopold Bloom in Dublin, June 16th, 1904. And we just follow him throughout the day as he goes about his day. But like Diana said, it follows the structure. And, many authors do this. You take the structure of a classic and then you apply it in a modern text. And it has a lot to say, as to I understand, and to build on what you said about relationships between the UK and Ireland. But, we're going about his day. But it's filled with, it's written in a stream of consciousness form, experimental prose, different accents, puns, parodies, allusions, rich characterization, etc. Who knows? Maybe Leopold ran into Judith Hearn at some point when he's walking around that day. Or no, she was in Belfast. Sorry, but I wish we were. It makes tackling Proust look interesting. That I could get through a few of the volumes at least, but this I just anyway. If you did not read the book, if you are unfamiliar with Joyce's relationship with Sylvia, she meets him at a party in 1920, and it's like meeting a rock star, and she takes him in like a mama, like Diana said, acting as his mother. I mean, doing everything for him. And he was such a diva, and he believed that genius should be catered to. So it was beyond entitlement. He felt it was the natural, nature of things. I don't know if he wasn't like a narcissist. He was just, anyway.
He was incredibly self-centered is what he was.
Right.
Yeah. And had the worst eyesight. Anyway, and then he pretty much drops her for Random House once the obscenity case is complete, and that's the end of that. So very interesting. Let's see. I can the reason why it was considered obscene let me give you the timeline. Now we're going from one timeline to another timeline. It was first serialized, lots of books were serialized in an American journal called the Little Review. And it was serialized from March of 18 to December of 20. What happened was it was the fourth episode was led to a prosecution for obscenity under the Comstock Act of 1873, where it's illegal to circulate materials deemed obscene by the U.S. mail. We remember our first mention of the Comstock Act when we were talking about diaphragms and birth control, and Margaret Sanger, who had to flee to Holland because she was promoting birth control. When she was in Holland, she found out about something called the Dutch cap and was packing them up and sending them in the mail to America. And that's where she gets in trouble. So, it's considered obscene. Why? Because it is in the fourth episode, or the fourth installment, that evidently there is a masturbation scene, but it is done in metaphoric language, and critics argue, first of all, who can understand what the hell he's writing? And secondly, with the metaphors on top of everything else, who knew? Like, the readers aren't even going to know. On top of that, there is another academic argument that says it really wasn't so much that chapter, but also published in the magazine, the same journal, was a poem by the Baroness Elsa von Freytag-Lorenhoven that was much more explicit erotic poetry. And that was the one that the Vice Commission declared obscene. So there's a trial in 1921 where it's declared obscene. And then in 1932, this is what happens when you can have powerful lawyers on your side, right? Random House arranges to import the French edition, because by now it's published, and have it seized by customs so they can go to court in the US versus one book called Ulysses. And if you remember in my research for the group, in the Comstock Act, what ends up going to court but the United States versus one condom, right? One condom that was sent to them. So we all picture this little condom sitting at the defense table. But anyway, the U.S. District Court judge rules that the book is not pornographic, therefore it can't be obscene. And they, of course, appeal in 34. So then the book, they win, and the book becomes, we've become the first country, English-speaking country, where the book is available. And it was only available openly in Ireland in the 1960s. So although Diane and myself are completely befuddled about why anyone would think this book is, the best thing next to sliced bread, here is what T.S. Eliot said in The Dial. And remember, Sylvia tried to get the Dial to pick it up and they wouldn't. But here's what he says in The Dial of Ulysses. I hold this book to be the most important expression which the present age has found. It is a book to which we are all indebted and from which none of us can escape. And he also went on to say that it wasn't Joyce's fault if people like you and me can't understand a word in it. Quote, the next generation is responsible for its own soul. A man of genius is responsible to his peers, not to a studio full of uneducated and undisciplined coxcombs.
So tell me how D.H. Lawrence and Henry Miller, how did they all get published finally?
That's a very good question. Because we
D.H.
have
Lawrence,
Go ahead.
D.H. Lawrence also had lawsuits against Lady Chatterley's lover, and it wasn't published until I think the 50s or 60s either. And Henry Miller, I'm not sure who published. Maybe he was first published in France too, because America was the year of the country of prudery at the time.
Mhm, mhm.
Americans escaped because they couldn't drink. It was the
Right.
time of prohibition. They couldn't publish stuff, and so young people like Hemingway and Anderson and others, Scott Fitzgerald, came over to Europe. Not to mention a lot of the African American poets who of course had to suffer from segregation in America. So, by the way, Sylvia Beach says somewhere in her book that she never thought that the name Lost Generation was appropriate. She said, "I never saw a generation that was less lost than they were, because they all found their way, and they made their way, and they became famous." And she supported them at their beginnings. She was very proud of having
I love
Hemingway as one of her.
I love that perspective. And, all you have to do is tell someone they're not allowed to have something and you ban it. And then you have to touch a soap if someone tells you it's hot. And this book, once Sylvia published it in France, it became such the it book. Everyone wanted it. Everyone claimed they read it. It became this incredibly hot, it created its own news. It would have been on page 6. She said, let's see. And the book had become a vanity item for tourists. Here's an article from the Washington Post. 10 years ago, on the shelf of some friend who had come back from Paris, you might have seen Ulysses, a fat, black-bound volume with the imprint of Shakespeare and Company. That friend may have guided you to the shelf. So having such high-class contraband, being able to sneaking that into your carry-on and getting through TSA was quite a coup, and sophisticated people would have shown you, look what we have. And Shakespeare and Company would help American and English customers disguise the jackets with less controversial volumes. I think he wanted it green. Didn't he want it a certain color of green? He was very, very picky. But anyway, one volume was called Shakespeare's Works, Complete in One Volume, or Merry Tales for Little Folks. I mean, how fun is that? And this is all way before, Random House, comes on. And then, she talks about in the book how all of a sudden he wants to see their contract, their scope of work, all the legal stuff. And she's like, make up whatever you want. I'll sign whatever you want. And she releases, everything. She releases everything to him. And that's when, he goes ahead and goes with Random House. I think Nora also probably thought, we can probably make more money, if we go with the bigger frame and whatever. So that it's kind of sad, but what's beautiful is how she handles it. She has grace and dignity, and, nothing's going to hurt her. She's like, she, not one drop of animus or anger at what, how he left her. She just figured people come in and out of your life, I suppose. Right. I'd love to hear from, if anyone else would like to chime in and tell me what you thought of the book, that would be great. Go ahead.
I loved the book.
You loved it?
I really loved it. Firstly, Judith Hearn had gotten me I don't know, I left her behind, but this one was beautiful and I enjoyed the authors that Sylvia Beach had brought in with their wives. I mean, I never thought of them as having family, like Hemingway going to dinner with his family, things like that. And the relationship with Joyce, I never read Ulysses, so I'll tell you that one. But I'd heard of all the banning, well, we're starting out in 1919 when we have a pandemic around the world. And so I felt comfortable looking at this period of time. Yes. You know, and wanting to learn more about it. Like you, Stacey, you're researching all this stuff. So the 1919 to the 20s, the roaring 20s, I ended, you know, until World War II. And I just thought that whole period, like what Diana was saying, is really where the meat of the book was. And then it went further. And so I watched Transatlantic on Netflix about Barry and Fry the other day. And again, getting these people out of Paris, into Spain, out of Spain, into, you know, just that whole period of time with intelligent artists and the book banning that's going on now. So, you know, just I thought it was fantastic.
I guess.
And I went to the library and there's this brand new novel out about it. Yeah, about Sylvia Beach and Shakespeare Company, and they're doing it at the library. They're going to review the book. But hers was
Oh, wow. I said,
yeah, hers is autobiography, memoir, kind of. And that is a historical fiction, probably. I took the book out and brought it back because I said, I don't want to get confused before I have our meeting here. So,
right.
I bet.
Okay,
you want to make any corollary between the idea of having gone through pandemic and then having all of these restrictions flying down on us to what's happening now?
Very interesting. Very interesting. I love the perspective. I love the perspective. Beautiful. Beth, would you like to add to the conversation? Can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
I'm glad Martha said what she did because I have a slightly different, I'm bringing a different perspective here. I want to read the book that Martha described because I thought that was what I was going to read. I thought it was going to be a historical fiction because I didn't know anything about the book. I learned so much, and I agree with all the comments I've heard about how valuable it is and how fascinating. But I happen to have already been reading The Last Bookstore in London, which is a historical fiction. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It does take place during World War II. It's charming, it's delightful, and you care about the characters. This book, it's a lot of name dropping, and I've learned so much. I'm very glad I read it, but it wasn't what I expected. So it took me a while to go, this is a good use of my time, you know. And Stacey, you're just such a wealth of knowledge. And I want to hear the next 3 years worth of information eventually about Sylvia Beach.
Good.
and my perspective on Ulysses, I have also an unusual understanding of it because I first learned about Ulysses on a tour in Dublin, a James Joyce tour. So
Wow.
It was amazing. So I kind of was learning about it before I read about it. I was like walking it, you know, and I was getting a walking tour of it. It was just.
Was it the tour of Leopold Bloom's day, or was it of James Joyce's life?
It was James Joyce's life, but of course Leopold Bloom's day was included, and you know, I even wrote a haiku about it, but I can't find it right.
So Bloom's Day, she actually coined that term for Leopold Bloom. That is the June 16th or whatever. I'll get the date wrong. Day, but she coined Bloom's Day, and it's celebrated, as Beth said. I mean, it's celebrated in Dublin. Have you read? Evidently, his easiest book is A Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man. Has anyone?
Yes.
Is that readable? Is that something?
It's very readable. It's wonderful. It starts his biography, his autobiography, which then blends into Ulysses. Stephen Dedalus, who is a character in the Artist as a Young Man, also appears in Ulysses in the first part.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's interesting. Maybe we need to consider that and have that under our belt. And then, of course, take the tour that Beth did. Like that would naturally follow.
Can
And
we make it a field trip?
we can't, yeah, that's what I meant. And I think that the Irish government should sponsor us because we're so amazing. And so,
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
so we'll just check into that right away, right?
I was not aware that Joyce was so into wordplay.
Yeah, he was evidently all about it. And I love a good pun. So
I do too, but I
yeah.
mean, he manipulates the words and whatever, which I love.
Right. You need to read 7 Types of Ambiguity by Elliot Perlman. He is a master of creating a sentence down to how it looks, like where the words fall in relation to one another. Fascinating. Okay. And that's 7 Types of Ambiguity is also a mathematical something that I'm sure Elise knows the formula to. But anyway, this is a book. Okay. Okay, I'm gonna just do that then. Fine, Beth, I will just do that. So here we go. Okay. I want to talk about the role of war. I'm going to go, well, let me back up here. It's Fitch. Okay, Fitch reveals Fitch. Oh, there is a book by Noel Fitch. I don't know if that's male or female. I'm thinking male by the spelling, called Sylvia Beach and the Lost Generation, A History of Literary Paris in the 20s and 30s. I think we'd all like that. Anyway, he had some very interesting things to say. His book reveals the importance of unmarried women in the Parisian expat avant-garde. Sylvia Beach is held right up there with Gertrude Stein. And I'm sure now, since we've read the book, Sylvia Beach will be the answer to a question on Jeopardy. But up to this point, everyone always thinks Gertrude Stein, but hopefully now we can elevate her with our karma that we put out there because we're so powerful. Anyway, these women, they were writers, publishers, editors, critics, patrons, personalities, and encouraging one another. Not a lot of throwing one another under the bus that we hear, nowadays, since I don't know, but evidently people throw people under the bus. I mean, it's such a horrible visual, but it's about, bringing everyone along, partnering, bringing everyone along with you. And can we imagine life without these unsung individuals who helped promote one another and bring everyone forward? I certainly cannot. It is said that Fitch makes clear in his book that a lot of these expats who went to Paris went because they could A, afford to, and B, they played at being artists and writers. And a lot of them had the money once they realized that it was looking pretty grim to go ahead and sail home, get out of town. Why did people like Hemingway even know about Shakespeare and Company? How would he even know to go there? The First World War, was responsible for the expats even coming to Paris, because in college campuses all over our country, the American Ambulance Field Service sent recruiters to recruit hundreds of young men to sign up during the war to drive ambulances. And we know this because Fitzgerald writes about this. So who were these people? E.E. Cummings, we haven't read him. John Peel Bishop, have not read him. And of course, Phyllis's man about town, John Dos Passos, in addition to Hemingway. Beach herself worked for the Red Cross. And Paris, like I said, was cheap. It was cultured. They settled in a low-class, low-rent neighborhoods on the left bank. They found day jobs. They worked at banks, at newspapers. So they found ways to support themselves. And these immigrants were not considered a threat. They were contributing to society. It's not like they were going to become a voting bloc and vote out whoever was in power. And look, Paris needed the money. So they welcomed them. It was a great place to go. So what happens is we start having waves of creativity. I heard Ernest Hemingway's in Paris. Well, I'm going to go too. So this starts happening as Diana pointed out at the beginning. We have this Puritan American, all the Vice Commission, ridiculous things like that, who are encroaching on creativity. So we're pushing people over. So what happens? We end up having a loop, a feedback loop of ideas, this huge, it's like our book club. We're all coming together and we're sharing ideas and we're being inspired and we're learning from one another. So that's what Shakespeare and Company offers us in a microcosm. The legacy of this bookstore, if you had to say one word, it would be a sanctuary. It served as an important source of dissemination of the creative output of American writers. Even Walt Whitman, Herman Melville, and others, they were able to be translated, and so they could be shared. Otherwise, they wouldn't have become popular in France. Not only were books sold, but they were lent or they were rented. This was a laboratory where people could create small literary reviews or have little private presses, and everyone was helping everyone out. So today we have zines, that these people are printing, a riff on magazines. So avant-garde literature that was experimental. We have this feedback loop happening. We're having the waves of creativity coming. It's all happening in the bookshop. And, presto changeo, we end up with this amazing, 20th century literature, that now is required reading in classrooms. Oh, excuse me. It used to be.
Yeah.
Now it's scary. So we won't let that stop us because we have a brain. So anyway, now what is Sylvia Beach's legacy? Here is a beautiful quote by a French author who I embarrassingly don't know. But anyway, he said, quote, Sylvia carried pollen like a bee. She cross-fertilized these writers. She did more to link England, the United States, Ireland, and France than 4 great ambassadors combined. It was not merely for the pleasure of friendship that Joyce, Hemingway, is it Bryer, BrYher? I'm not sure how to pronounce that. Diana, could you unmute and tell me the proper pronunciation?
Bryer.
Bryer. Okay.
It is Bryer? Okay.
Bryer. The friendship that Joyce, Hemingway, Bryer, and so many others often took the path to Shakespeare and Company in the heart of Paris. He said, to meet there and meet all these French writers, it's nothing more than mysterious that such fertilizations happen through dialogue, reading, simple contact. She also introduced people to one another. She talks about introducing Sherwood and Hemingway to Gertrude and F. Scott Fitzgerald to Joyce. She was called the central enabler of the transatlantic modernist literary avant-garde, which she effectively ran from her bookshop, Shakespeare and Company. She was considered a common denominator. She was house mother, banker, post office, clipping service, translator, cheering section, the midwife of modern literature, and the champion of new ideas. For 2 decades, it is said, she influenced and shaped what we know as modern literature. I found an article from 2010 in the New York Times. It is a review of a book about her, and they call her, quote, one literary lioness and the fearless owner of Shakespeare and Company. She's also